The year was 1944. The war in the Pacific had reached its breaking point. Allied forces were closing in from all sides, and Japan's empire, once stretching across oceans, was collapsing piece by piece. In a quiet training camp deep in the mountains of Japan, a young intelligence officer named Hiroo Onoda prepared for a mission unlike any other. He was 22 years old, sharp, disciplined, and utterly devoted to his duty. Trained in guerrilla warfare and survival tactics, Onoda was taught that a true soldier never surrendered, no matter the cost. The instructors told him, "You are not to die. You are not to give yourself up. You are to continue fighting, even if it takes years." Those words would become his entire life. By late December 1944, Onoda received his orders. He was to deploy to Lubang Island in the Philippines. His mission was to gather intelligence, destroy enemy supplies, and conduct guerrilla warfare behind enemy lines. He was to disrupt the Allied forces by any means necessary. When he arrived, the situation was far worse than expected. The Japanese garrison on Lubang was small, poorly supplied, and already under pressure from American and Filipino troops. Many soldiers doubted the mission would last even a few weeks. But Onoda, with his deep sense of loyalty, believed that Japan's final victory was still possible. The jungle became his new world. Dense bamboo forests, relentless rain, and the constant hum of insects surrounded him day and night. Alongside a few comrades, he built shelters, rationed food, and prepared for long-term resistance. They avoided open battle, striking only when the opportunity arose. Ambushing patrols, cutting supply lines, and burning rice stores meant for the enemy. Every sound in the jungle could mean danger. Every shadow could hide a soldier. Then, in early 1945, the island fell. American troops swept through, overpowering Japanese forces. The remaining soldiers were either killed, captured, or scattered into the wilderness. Onoda and a handful of men, Private Yuichi Akatsu, Corporal Shoichi Shimada, and Private Kinshichi Kozuka, vanished into the thick jungle. To them, the war was far from over. They hid during the day and moved only at night. They stole food from local farms, read discarded newspapers for signs of the war's progress, and tried to contact what they believed were other Japanese units. In March 1945, leaflets began falling from the sky. Printed in Japanese, they claimed that the war had ended, that Japan had surrendered. Onoda picked one up and studied it under the moonlight. It read, "The war ended on August 15th. The Imperial Army has ceased all combat activities." He shook his head. It had to be a trick. Enemy propaganda meant to lure them out. He told his men, "The Americans are clever. They want us to surrender. We will not fall for it." And so they stayed. Months turned into years. Rain soaked their uniforms until they rotted into rags. Their rifles rusted, but they maintained them meticulously, convinced they would be needed again. They set up hidden camps deep within the forest, moving constantly to avoid detection. At night, they built fires so small that the flame barely reached their hands. They whispered about home, about the families they missed, the food they craved, the Tokyo streets that now existed only in memory. They still believed that one day, Japan would return for them. By the end of 1945, Japan had been devastated by atomic bombings, cities reduced to ash, and the emperor himself had surrendered. But for Onoda and his men, isolated in the jungles of Lubang, the world had stopped in 1944. Every time they saw planes overhead, they believed it was part of a continuing war. Every distant gunshot or explosion, a sign that Japan was still fighting somewhere beyond the sea. They survived on bananas, coconuts, and rice stolen from local farmers. Sometimes they clashed with Filipino police patrols, mistaking them for enemy soldiers. A few villagers claimed to have seen Japanese ghosts haunting the island's forests. But these were no ghosts. Only men still at war, trapped in time. As the months turned into years, one by one, Onoda's comrades began to falter. The loneliness was unbearable, the jungle unforgiving. Private Akatsu surrendered first, slipping away one night in 1949. Onoda took it as betrayal. He wrote in his journal, "A soldier's duty does not end because others lose faith. I will continue." The group shrank to 3, Onoda, Shimada, and Kozuka, still loyal to an empire that no longer existed. By 1950, they had been fighting a war that ended 5 years earlier. The year was 1950. Across the world, cities that once lay in ruins were being rebuilt. The war that had torn continents apart was now a distant memory for most, a story told in books, museums, and fading photographs. But on a small, forgotten island in the Philippines, the war was still very much alive. Hiroo Onoda and his remaining comrades continued their mission with unwavering conviction. For them, surrender was not an option. It was shame. Every fiber of their being was built upon loyalty to the emperor, discipline to the mission, and refusal to yield. Even though the jungles around them had grown silent, they remained alert. Each rustle in the leaves could be an enemy scout. Each strange sound, a threat. They had been trained to distrust everything the enemy might use against them. So when local villagers left leaflets, newspapers, and even recorded messages urging them to surrender, Onoda saw deception. He studied each piece carefully, analyzing the paper, the ink, and even the phrasing, convinced that true orders would only come directly from a commanding officer. But the truth was simple. No one from his command remained. Japan had surrendered years ago. His superiors were either dead or back home, living civilian lives in a new, peaceful Japan. The war that Onoda still fought had long ended, except in his mind. In the jungles of Lubang, time lost all meaning. The seasons came and went. Rain poured endlessly, soaking their clothes until they were heavy and moldy. The humid air clung to their skin, and the buzzing of insects became their constant companion. They repaired their uniforms using bark and vines, keeping the old insignia stitched carefully onto their shoulders, symbols of a nation that no longer existed. They lived off the land, hunting wild pigs, trapping small animals, and stealing rice from local fields at night. They dried the grains in makeshift huts, preserving them as rations for what they believed would be a long campaign. And still, Onoda waited for his next command. Every so often, they'd see Filipino police or local search parties combing the area. They assumed these were Allied patrols still hunting them. Occasionally, they opened fire, brief, confused skirmishes that left villagers terrified. To the people of Lubang, these men had become ghosts, dangerous, silent phantoms of a war long over. By 1952, Japan had officially regained independence after Allied occupation. Newspapers published stories about missing soldiers believed to be hiding in distant jungles, still unaware of the war's end. Onoda's family, now living in post-war Japan, had long believed he was dead. His mother lit incense for him every year on the anniversary of his disappearance. She prayed not for his victory, but for his peace. Yet, somewhere deep in the tropical forest, her son remained alive, armed, vigilant, and convinced that one day, Japan would call him back to service. Years blurred together. By 1954, the group had shrunk again. Corporal Shoichi Shimada was killed during a brief clash with a search party. The loss struck Onoda hard. Shimada had been one of the most disciplined soldiers he'd ever known. Brave, precise, loyal. He buried him in a small clearing under the dense canopy, marking the grave with a simple wooden cross. Now there were only two, Onoda and Kozuka. They carried on their duties, patrolling the hills, cleaning their rifles, and observing the beaches from a distance. They recorded every sound of aircraft and every flicker of movement they could see from their hidden shelters. Every so often, they'd spot modern fishing boats and assume they were American vessels disguised to spy on them. It wasn't ignorance. It was belief, unshakable, absolute, drilled into them since youth. To surrender was to dishonor. To give up was to die in disgrace. Oh, for them, the only truth was the mission. In Japan, meanwhile, a new generation had grown up, one that had never known war. The once militarized nation was now rebuilding into a peaceful industrial power. The emperor who had once commanded total devotion now appeared on television, a distant, humanized figure. The contrast could not have been greater. While Tokyo's skyline filled with neon and trains roared through rebuilt stations, Onoda still crouched in the underbrush of Lubang, whispering commands and watching the horizon. The jungle was his entire world, a universe that smelled of damp soil, rotting leaves, and smoke from their tiny fires. In 1959, 14 years after the war's end, villagers once again reported sightings of Japanese soldiers. Filipino authorities conducted search missions, dropping leaflets with updated photographs and letters from families. Onoda read one, trembling slightly as he recognized the handwriting, his own brother's. It begged him to come home, assuring him the war was long over. He stared at it for a long time, then whispered, "They have captured my brother. They are forcing him to write this." And with that, he folded the letter carefully, tucked it inside his pack, and returned to his duties. By the early 1960s, Onoda had been hiding for nearly 20 years. Kozuka, his last surviving companion, remained at his side, though both men were aging and weary. Their uniforms were little more than patched cloth. Their weapons, still functional, were cleaned daily. Their commitment never wavered. When they heard distant explosions, fireworks or dynamite from construction, they assumed the war had reignited. When planes flew overhead, they ducked and waited. Every sound was a threat, every silence a trap. Their lives had become an endless loop. Survival, watchfulness, and devotion to an empire that existed only in memory. Then, in 1972, nearly 3 decades after the end of World War II, fate finally intervened. During a routine police patrol near Lubang's rice fields, a gunshot rang out. Kozuka was struck and killed, the last of Onoda's companions. For the first time in 28 years, Hiroo Onoda was completely alone. He buried Kozuka beneath a palm tree and stood silently for hours, the weight of years pressing down on him. His war had taken everything, friends, youth, and nearly his sanity. Yet he still refused to believe it was over. He whispered, "I will not leave my post until my commander relieves me." He didn't know it, but his time in the jungle was finally running out. By 1972, the world had changed beyond recognition. Men had walked on the moon. Television broadcast color images into homes across continents. The children of those who had fought in the war were now adults, raising families in a time of peace and prosperity. But for one man, deep in the dense jungles of Lubang Island, time had stopped in 1945. Hiroo Onoda was now in his early 50s, but his face had hardened into that of a man twice his age. His uniform, though tattered and faded, was always clean. His rifle, an old Arisaka Type 99, was still oiled and ready. He moved through the jungle like a shadow, silent, careful, always watching. The forest had become both his home and his battlefield. He hunted small animals, fished in secret pools, and collected rainwater in bamboo tubes. Every day, he patrolled his territory, scanning for what he believed were enemy movements. When he found modern wrappers or cans, he thought they were American traps designed to expose his position. He kept a small diary, a few lines scratched into a worn notebook. He recorded the weather, the crops he stole, the movements of villagers. It was the log of a soldier still fighting a forgotten war. He built small shelters from palm leaves and bamboo. When one was discovered, he moved to another, disappearing deeper into the wilderness. When he caught sight of Filipino farmers, he avoided them, sometimes taking food, sometimes warning shots, believing they were enemy collaborators. In the dark solitude of the forest, sounds became his companions. The rustle of leaves, the croak of frogs, the distant echo of church bells drifting on the wind. Every time he heard the bells, he thought they were signals, coded messages from the Japanese army, proof that the war still continued somewhere beyond the horizon. As the years dragged on, reality began to blur. Onoda occasionally found newspapers floating downstream or blown by the wind. Articles about Japan hosting the Olympics, men landing on the moon, the Vietnam War raging nearby. To him, these were clever lies, elaborate enemy propaganda designed to break his will. He had been trained to resist psychological warfare, and so he refused to believe. Still, loneliness pressed down like a physical weight. At night, he sometimes dreamed of home, the smell of miso soup, his mother's voice calling him in from the rain, his father's quiet pride when he'd joined the army. He would wake up drenched in sweat, his heart pounding, and clutch his rifle tightly, reminding himself, "You are still a soldier. You cannot surrender." He began to speak aloud to the jungle, whispering tactical plans to no one, giving orders to an invisible platoon. His mind remained sharp, a soldier's discipline refusing to yield, but his soul carried the scars of endless solitude. In Japan, stories of the soldier who refused to surrender began to surface. Expeditions were sent to Lubang, hoping to find him. Photographs of him as a young officer were printed in newspapers, but every attempt failed. Onoda stayed hidden, convinced each search party was part of an elaborate enemy operation. When they dropped leaflets written by his family, he dismissed them as forgeries. He would later recall, "If the war had truly ended, my commander would have come for me himself." Those words became his unbreakable creed. Then, in early 1974, fate finally intervened. A young Japanese adventure, rear-named Norio Suzuki, arrived on Lubang Island. He was not a soldier or an official, just a curious traveler. He had told his friends before leaving Japan, "I am going to look for Lieutenant Onoda, a panda, and the abominable snowman," in that order. When Suzuki finally stumbled upon Onoda in the jungle, the soldier aimed his rifle and shouted in Japanese, "Don't move! Who are you?" Suzuki raised his hands and said calmly, "I am Japanese. The war ended a long time ago." Onoda didn't lower his weapon. For hours, the two men spoke. Suzuki explained that Japan had lost the war, that Emperor Hirohito had surrendered, and that the entire world had changed. But Onoda refused to believe it. He said, "I will not surrender until my commanding officer orders it. I was given my mission, and only he can relieve me." Suzuki nodded slowly and promised to return. He kept his word. Weeks later, he came back with an elderly man dressed in a crisp uniform. Major Yoshimi Taniguchi, Onoda's former commanding officer, now a bookseller in civilian life. It had been 29 years since they had last seen each other. Taniguchi saluted Onoda and read the official order. "Lieutenant Onoda, the war is over. You are relieved of your duties." For the first time in nearly 3 decades, Onoda's expression broke. His lips trembled and his eyes filled with tears. Slowly, almost unwillingly, He unbuckled his rifle, removed the bayonet, and handed it over. He stood at attention and saluted, his voice quiet but steady. "The mission is complete. I have returned." The war that had consumed his entire life was finally over. When he emerged from the jungle, crowds gathered in disbelief. Cameras flashed. Reporters shouted questions. Onoda wore his old uniform, carefully repaired and pressed, his sword still at his side. Despite his years in the wilderness, he looked strong, proud, unbroken. He apologized to the families of those who had been harmed during his years of hiding. The Philippine president, Ferdinand Marcos, granted him a full pardon, recognizing that Onoda had believed he was still at war. After 29 years of duty, he returned home to Japan, a country he no longer recognized. In March 1974, the world watched as a lone man stepped out of a Philippine jungle and into history. Hiroo Onoda, the soldier who refused to surrender, was finally going home. As he boarded the aircraft bound for Tokyo, his heart raced with a strange mix of fear, pride, and disbelief. For nearly 3 decades he had dreamed of this moment, of marching back into a victorious Japan. But as he looked out the small airplane window, he saw something unexpected: bright city lights, highways, and towers glimmering below. This was not the Japan he had left behind. The moment his plane touched down, photographers surged forward, their cameras clicking like machine guns. Television crews broadcast his arrival live. Across Japan, millions watched as a man from another time, dressed in an old, patched uniform and carrying a rusted rifle, stepped onto modern soil. Crowds lined the airport fences, waving flags and shouting his name. To many, he was a living legend. To others, a relic of an age long gone. Onoda stood motionless for a moment, overwhelmed by the noise and the lights. Then, slowly he saluted the sky, the gesture of a soldier who had never abandoned his post. When he returned to his family, the reunion was silent and emotional. His mother, now an elderly woman, embraced him with trembling hands. She had mourned him for decades, burning incense for a son she believed lost. He whispered softly, "Mother, I kept my promise." She wept, not for his return, but for the 29 years that had vanished. Onoda found himself in a world he could barely understand. Television had replaced radio. Automobiles filled the streets. Children played with toys from America. Japan, once a militarized empire, was now a peaceful, industrial nation. People no longer bowed before the emperor's portrait. The imperial war banners he had once fought under were gone. He wandered through Tokyo like a ghost, staring at the neon signs and crowds rushing past. He had missed the transformation, from a world of sacrifice and duty to one of comfort and progress. For Onoda, it felt as though the war had ended yesterday. For everyone else, it was history. The Japanese government honored him as a symbol of loyalty and endurance. He received back pay for his years of service, totaling just a few $1,000s, a token compared to the decades he had lost. Newspapers hailed him as the last soldier of the emperor. Students wrote him letters, calling him a hero. Others questioned his sanity, asking how a man could ignore so much evidence and live in hiding for so long. But Onoda never apologized for his obedience. In interviews, he spoke calmly and firmly. Every Japanese soldier was taught to fight until ordered otherwise. I was given my mission, and I carried it out. To him, it had not been madness. It had been duty. Still, beneath the stoic surface, the adjustment was difficult. He struggled to fit into modern Japan. The discipline and purpose that had defined his existence were gone. He couldn't understand the fast pace, the materialism, the absence of the strict values he'd lived by. He once remarked, "Japan has changed too much. People care only about comfort now. The spirit I knew is gone." He tried working different jobs but found no satisfaction. Crowds and noise made him uneasy. The jungle had been harsh, but it had been simple. Survival, loyalty, and mission. Here, surrounded by modernity, he felt lost. In 1975, searching for meaning, Onoda moved to Brazil, where he bought a small cattle ranch. The open fields reminded him of the Soas, a freedom of the jungle. There he lived quietly for years, far from the eyes of the world. He married, worked the land, and taught himself to adapt, slowly, patiently, as he had done for nearly 3 decades in the wild. But Japan never forgot him. He occasionally returned for public lectures, speaking to students and soldiers about perseverance, discipline, and belief. His story had become a legend, a parable of duty beyond reason, faith beyond doubt. He often told audiences, humans need something to believe in. Without it, we are lost. As time passed, the controversies around him softened. What had once been seen as fanaticism was now viewed as dedication. Even those who had criticized him began to respect the sheer endurance of his spirit. He became a living bridge between 2 worlds, the one that had vanished in 1945 and the one that had risen from its ashes. When asked if he regretted anything, Onoda replied quietly, "I regret that so many years were spent fighting an illusion, but I do not regret my loyalty. I did what I believed was right." Those words summed up his entire existence, the balance between duty and doubt, obedience and truth. By the late 1980s, Hiroo Onoda had become more than a man. He was a living symbol of loyalty pushed to its limits, of belief stronger than time, of the strange ways war never truly ends for those who fight it. In Brazil, he lived quietly on his ranch, tending cattle under the same sun that once beat down on the Philippine jungle. The habits of the soldier never left him. He rose before dawn, kept his tools lined in perfect order, and cleaned his rifle every week, though it had not fired a bullet in decades. He received thousands of letters from around the world. Some called him a hero, others a fool. Yet every message shared one thing: awe at the endurance of his conviction. When he finally returned to Japan for good in the 1990s, the world had changed again. Tokyo's skyline shimmered with glass towers. Bullet trains raced through stations where once steam engines had groaned. Children carried cell phones instead of wooden toys. Onoda, now an elderly man in neatly pressed clothes, walked through the crowds unnoticed. Only when someone recognized his name did faces light up with a mixture of wonder and disbelief. He was often invited to speak at schools and military academies. Standing before rows of young students, he spoke softly, his voice steady, his eyes sharp. "A soldier must live with purpose," he would say. "Even in peace, find something worth serving." He never glorified war. Instead, he warned about its power to consume the soul. He told the young, "If you dedicate yourself to something, know what it truly means. Blind faith can make you strong, but it can also chain you." In 1996, he founded the Onoda Nature School, where he taught outdoor survival skills to children. He believed modern society had made people soft, too dependent on comfort, too detached from nature. In the mountains, he felt alive again. He taught the students how to read the wind, how to find water, how to survive with discipline and respect for the land. To them, he wasn't just a former soldier. He was a living legend, a man who had endured when the world forgot him. When journalists asked him what he had learned from his decades in the jungle, he paused for a long time before answering. "I learned that the world is not simple. Truth is not always clear. But if you stop believing in something, you die inside." Those words carried the weight of a lifetime. In 2014, at the age of 91, Hiroo Onoda passed away peacefully in Tokyo. Japan mourned him with quiet respect. Newspapers printed headlines that read, "The war has finally ended for Lieutenant Onoda." At his funeral, old veterans saluted. Younger soldiers bowed. Some wept, not for his death, but for the strange beauty of his conviction. He was buried with full military honors, his sword laid across his coffin, the same blade he had carried through rain, mud, and decades of solitude. Even now, Onoda's story lives on, in books, documentaries, and classrooms around the world. Historians still debate whether he was a hero or a tragic figure trapped by his own duty. But for millions who hear his tale, he represents something deeper. The question of how far a person will go for what they believe in. His life reminds us that war does not truly end when guns fall silent. It lives in memory, in loyalty, and in the human heart's refusal to let go of the past. For nearly 30 years, Hiroo Onoda's world was frozen in 1945. When he finally stepped out of the jungle, he walked not just into a different Japan, but into another century. And yet, he never regretted his endurance. "I did what I was told to do," he once said. "I was a soldier, and a soldier does not quit." Those words echo through history, both inspiring and haunting. They remind us that courage and conviction can be noble, but when carried too far, they can imprison the soul. Still, in a world that often forgets commitment, Onoda's story stands as proof that belief, even belief in a vanished cause, can shape a life more completely than any victory. As the camera fades on his portrait, the young officer in his crisp uniform, eyes fierce with purpose, the narrator's voice softens. For 29 years, one man fought a war that had ended long ago. He was alone, forgotten, and unyielding. When he finally laid down his rifle, he did not surrender his spirit. In his heart, the battle between duty and truth had never truly ended. The screen fades to black, and the faint sound of jungle rain echoes, a whisper from the past.